Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, CA Agnostic Certificate Lifecycle Management for the Modern Enterprise. I'm Kristen Santos, Marketing Specialist at Sectigo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Presenting with us today, we have Jason Soroko, CTO of PKI Sectigo. Hi, Jason. How are you?
Hello, Kristen. Doing really well, thank you.
Great. And we also have Sectigo's Chief Compliance Officer, Tim Callan. Hey, Tim. How's it going?
Hi, Kristen. Doing great.
Awesome. Great to have you guys. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, which we expect to be around 45 minutes and allow for 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. You'll be able to submit any questions throughout using the chat. But that's it from me. Tim, without further ado, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, very much. So Jason and I want to talk about what has become kind of an emerging buzzword in the industry, which is this concept of CA agnostic, or I think we're actually going to refine it a little bit and talk to you about a concept of certificate agnostic, which is sort of CA agnostic up leveled by one. And to understand that, I think it's valuable, first of all, that we talk about how the digital landscape today is different from what it was, I'd say, even a few years ago, Jason. 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah, it's changing really quickly, and in fact, the dinosaur age of 2019 and before, you could almost consider a different era than what we're in right now.
Right. It's crazy how fast things have changed, and pardon me, and where certificate lifecycle management enters into this new digital world. And then from there, we'll get into some detail explaining this concept of CA agnostic or certificate agnostic and where it fits into the whole thing. So with that, why don't we start with our changing agenda? So Jason, you started on this. I'll encourage you to keep going. It is a very different world from what it was even a few years ago.
Tim, I would like to even just highlight one, just one point off of this, which is everything you see to the left are things that pre-2019, these are things that were very entrenched. People were dealing with certificates in all these areas for 20, 30 years plus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you take a look now, if you were to ask somebody, hey, DevOps and X509 certificates, what's the value there? You might not realize that there's a company called HashiCorp that just IPO'd at $14 billion. Their entire DevOps concept didn't, probably wasn't even in the minds of somebody all that long ago. And that's how fast things have changed.
Yeah, and without certificates, it just plain couldn't work, right? And some of these other ones, Jay, you talk about hot topics, right? Zero trust, passwordless, robotic process automation. These are big things that lots of CIOs
and notice
are.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And notice at that bottom right, we didn't say SSH keys. This is our SSH certificates, a completely new thing that allows that key pair to be wrapped in a policies envelope. And these are things that have not been thought about till just recently. And certainly they allow for some new transformational use cases.
Right. And so suddenly we find ourselves in this situation where we are having to deal with all of these things. Like if we're not doing DevOps, if we're not allowing the use of BYOD devices for employee productivity, if we're not thinking about passwordless, if we're not enabling RPA, if we're not doing zero trust, then we're not keeping up. Remote identity validation. How about dealing with COVID? How about dealing with the fact that everybody's working at home, right? We didn't even mention that one. If you're not doing that stuff, you're not keeping up, and you're not a modern IT enterprise, and you're not going to be able to stay competitive, and you're not going to be able to stay secure, right?
Yeah, Tim. Document signing, that's been around an awfully long time. But if you think about that in the enterprise, quite often it was you had one signing certificate for an entire enterprise, and you would sign major documents. Now you're dealing with every employee sometimes having their own certificate. That brings in the issues of scale. How do you manage that? In other words, Tim, the PKIs that are managing the new transformational use cases cannot be your grandpa's PKI.
Right. And one of the ways that's the case is that it's about scale, like you said. It's about raw numbers, right? The number of certificates I'm dealing with is orders of magnitude bigger than it was just a few years ago. But it's also about what I want to say variety. The kinds and configurations of certificates and how they're applied has also absolutely exploded in the last 24 to 36 months.
We've always been good at issuance, but we've never been as good as now as at issuance at the scale of, say, DevOps or IoT.
Right.
And the other thing that we've had to get very good at is another idea, which is provisioning. So it's not just issuing that cert, it's about getting the cert where it needs to be
Yeah.
when it needs to be there.
Yeah. Correctly
And
installed.
so, yeah, and so a whole host of technologies have to be brought to bear for this, to be able to deal with this proliferation of use cases.
Right. So enter the concept of CLM, certificate lifecycle management. And this is another good example, right, where this idea isn't new. Certainly, there have been platforms that people presently would describe as a certificate lifecycle management or CLM platform that have been around for a long time, but it's only been in the last, I don't know, I'm going to say year or so that this category has had a name.
That's right. The analysts, of course, are giving this a name, but certainly every one of the, a number of the major CAs have had to deal with certificates at some level, especially public certificates. I think what's different now, though, Tim, is of course that proliferation of use cases is causing people to have to look at, all right, we now have a number of private trust use cases on top of our public usage. We want to be able to take that tradition of public certificate management, which we've known was a good idea for a long time, and then extend that out so that we have visibility across our usage of those digital identities. Thing is, not everybody's the same in terms of things we just talked about: issuance scale, provisioning technologies, and then of course, we in the industry we have some vendors that are, have that tradition of being a CA, and some that do not. And to us, what we're saying here is it shouldn't matter where the certificate is issued from. It's all
Right.
about everything else that surrounds the management of those certificates and their life cycles.
Yeah, and so for a CLM solution to be successful, you've thrown some of these things out, but I'm going to go back to this concept of saying um, it's about the variety and it's about universal coverage. And we'll give you a list a little later on of how we break that down. But just imagine these certificates that you're using. It's not just that you're using more of them. It's not just that the stakes are higher, although that's incredibly important, right? Because everything's got a digital identity now, and every part of your business is digital. And if it doesn't have a digital identity, it's not secure. And if it does, then that's a risk factor. And we've got the idea of cascading outages, right? One thing stops working, and that means everything downstream of it stops working, and it spreads out and it becomes everything, right? And so that means the stakes are much higher. But then in addition to that, in particular, this idea of saying the breadth and variety and changeability of these digital IDs and the certificates that enable those has also exploded, which is a lot of the point that we're really trying to emphasize today. So yeah. So this CLM. So I mentioned this, but this cascading failure concept is very real, and this high stakes concept is very real. And we just pulled some examples out of the press, out of the headlines, but we literally this could have been 100 items long. But we all may remember some of these. The O2 outage from a couple or 3 years ago, 40 million-ish people had no cell phone coverage for a day across multiple continents. And at the end of the day, it was due to a single unknown expired certificate. One certificate cost probably an estimated 100 million in SLAs penalties. Or if we, drop down to the bottom right, the Equifax breach from 2017 that cost so many individuals their PII, and it cost Equifax a federal fine of $700 million, let alone the other damage, the credit monitoring services they had to purchase for the victims of the attack and all the rest, reputational damage and all that owed itself to expired certificates at the end of the day. So the consequences can be vast, and even if they're not this big, an outage that prevents your processes from functioning or stops manufacturing on the floor, or means that employee productivity gets shut down, or means that a customer has a bad user experience, even if it's not at this scale, those are very important things. And those are things that are going on, like I said, all the time. You and I are seeing headlines a couple times a month, and that's the stuff that makes it to the headlines.
Anytime you're depending on a system that trusts that people will happen to remember for a certificate to be reissued, renewed, whatever the process is, this seems to be problematic, Tim, all the way up to companies that really do have the resources that are necessary to fix this with CLM.
Right.
And there's a ton, as you said, of examples of outages that have happened over the years, with companies that aren't even that much smaller, all the way down to small companies, obviously, where basically it comes down to the problem of some developer somewhere, shadow ops, shadow development, shadow IT, that just go off and purchase their publicly trusted certificates from somewhere. Nothing's really kept for guaranteed renewal. And when you add all these different privately trusted use cases, that just multiplies it by orders of magnitude. And this problem is real. And
Yeah.
fortunately, the solution for this is good certificate lifecycle management.
Right. So what does good certificate lifecycle management look like? So, and I think maybe we kind of covered this, right? Maybe we should move past this, but, certainly, at least at a minimum, let's look at the, that chart on the lower left sort of gives you a sense of the broad set of real world use cases that are happening today and what you need to do to be able to keep them.
Yeah, I think, Tim, people on the bottom, web security, that whole idea of SSL certificates is something a lot of people know about very well, but a lot of people don't realize, right? Email, SMIME is a form of a certificate that needs to be managed. You're going to be doing things in multiple clouds and need hierarchical trust models to expand upon. That's why we have a multi-cloud on the list. But not that long ago, we did not have concepts such as DevOps and IoT. DevOps, for example, people might wonder, why is this on the list? Well, TLS certificates are used extensively in the orchestration of DevOps containers. In fact, the lifecycle compared to publicly trusted certificates can be hours rather than a year. And so therefore, good CLM is intimately needed for some of these new transformational use cases.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you and I had, just to do that DevOps thing, you and I had a guest on our podcast at one point who was a DevOps engineer. And I think you posed him the question. I think it was you said, how long do you guys set a certificate for? And he said 2 hours, right? So they're doing private root TLS certificates that are expiring every 2 hours, right? It's just a whole different world. This is what you said about not your grandpa's PKI, right? It's a whole different world from what you expected. So what does a successful CLM look like? And I think, this just kind of lists a few of the core capabilities that you care about. One of them, of course, is just being able to see, right? Visibility on what your certificates are, the ones that are already in the system, and an ability to find new ones that are out there in the world and bring them into the system. And
yeah, Jim. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please. And that visibility needs to take the forms that make sense for you, right? So you need to be able to categorize things, understand the quality of them, think about things like dashboards and reports and alerts And all of that is really important in terms of understanding what you have and where it is. Because if you don't know what you have, you can't manage it. You can't ensure that it's compliant. You can't revoke it if it needs revocation, and you can't make sure that it gets renewed.
Tim, I would go as far as to say first principles of anything that comes under the category of security is if you can't do inventory or if you're not
Right.
doing inventory, the bad guy will,
Right.
and you have automatically failed. This is step one.
And if we go back to those examples from a couple slides ago, sorry for me to moving back, at least 3 of these were due to certificates that people did not realize were in place until the outage occurred.
Visibility
So,
is key.
yeah, visibility is key. Absolutely. So that's a big one. Visibility and knowing what's there, and like it said, continuance. And then, of course, this says issuance, but as you said, provisioning, right? The real issuance is great, but what you really need is the certificate on the piece of hardware that it needs to be on, installed correctly, and operating, right? And that's kind of that whole last mile component of provisioning is very valuable and very important.
That last mile can be actually quite complex sometimes, Tim. If you think about
Sure.
manufacturing use cases, sometimes devices, chipsets are created in a fab plant, perhaps even assembled to a certain point, issued with a manufacturing certificate, which is only trusted basically like a serial number, which then needs to be replaced with an operational uh, certificate, which has been issued, with all the policies that reflect the CP and CPS. Not to get into the weeds, but basically,
Yeah.
there's quite a number of handshakes and agreements that have to happen. This is very, very true in terms of consortia where you have interoperability. These are all these are all the things that PKI has promised us for 20 years plus and can deliver on if there's an associated CLM.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned consortia. It makes me think about. I just popped into my head one of the one of the ones I always found to be interesting was the Aeromax consortium, which basically covers everything around commercial air flights. So when I fly an airplane commercially with passengers on it, how do we ensure that that is secure? And one of the requirements that they have is every time a commercial air flight takes off, everything that has to do with that plane has a certificate on it. So every system in that plane has its own certificate, right? Not one cert per plane, but hundreds or thousands, depending on the size and the model of certificates, and everything else that interacts with it. So when the luggage cart pulls up, that luggage cart is certificate signed. When the drink cart pulls up and they bring the drinks in, that's certificate signed. All of those things have certificates. And every one of those certificates must be renewed every time the plane takes off. So they're all fresh every time.
Yeah, talk about the need for certificate lifecycle management.
Right?
You don't have a Linux administrator sitting on that airplane
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
that renewal. This has to be true CLM.
And if they're not, literally the plane won't fly. The plane can't fly. Because
And this is happening right now. There are airports around the world where quite literally the catering truck that is pulling up, the broadband communication that's telling the pilot the distance between the catering truck and the airplane, that communication is being protected with a TLS certificate.
Sure, as it should be, right? And there's good reasons for that because that otherwise that's a way in, right? And we've seen a lot of examples of this. People get in through something that appears to be innocuous. You and I talked not long ago about the printer spool, right? Using the printer spool as a doorway to get in and laterally move and do other bad things inside of the enterprise network, right? So okay, yeah, go on.
No, go ahead, Tim.
So, and then actual lifecycle management, right? And, like I said, you got to know they're there. You got to know when they're expiring. You got to be able to revoke them if need be. You got to be able to replace the ones you revoked if need be. And at the end of the day, every certificate expires. And unless its use cases is finished, unless it's sunsetted, that certificate needs renewal. And so all of that stuff must be done successfully and correctly. And to do that, we need the other things we already talked about. we need visibility, we need provisioning. Without that, we can't accomplish this part of the needs.
This is true across public and private use cases, and it's true across all those other uh, transformational use cases we talked about. This is not just visibility of a certificate that has been issued, it's visibility within its context, which is incredibly important.
Right. And that actually directly ties into this, again, this concept of agnostic. So maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but like riff a little on this idea of context. What kinds of things constitute context?
So, Tim, as you know, the certificates themselves have very important rules around how they're issued. And you and I have podcasted quite a lot about things such as, the bit lengths, cryptographic algorithms,
Sure.
and what are their originations, right? In other words, which CA did they come from?
Where
And
did it
as
come
soon as you,
from?
where
Right.
where do they how are they formed and where do they come from? Like
Yeah.
these things are fundamental, and it's something that you should expect to see within any form of modern interface. And that really touches on this idea of a CA agnostic system, which is, I think, when the natural conclusion of PKI is upon us, which is now, with this, we no longer have any reasoning to be able to say, look, you got to sole source your certificates, and you have to be kind of, you know completely tunnelized that way. It makes actually no sense when you
Yeah.
think about this proliferation of use cases, even the proliferation of use cases within publicly trusted certificates, Tim, where the world
Yeah.
that you live in the most. I would say that as soon as you envision what would be my ideal visibility platform in my CLM, the whole idea of I also need to know the origination of the certificate, including, the CA, whatever intermediate CA came from and what it's rooted up to. Why not just say it can come from anywhere of my
Yeah.
choosing? And I think that's just the way you have to be in a modern CLM.
Right. And I think that's a good point. And that probably is going directly to the next. Actually, it's not. And I do want to touch on this point of key management because this is an important point too. So let's put a pin in that concept because I want to come back to it. But while we're working on this slide, Jay, let's talk about key management.
Sure, Tim. So, in other words, quite often you're going to be dealing with, you know, there's the certificate itself being the envelope for a key pair that's generated. And I think what a lot of people need to understand is that a very important part of certificate lifecycle management is also key management. And so, therefore, you know, where do the keys, especially in terms of the root key, which is signing
Mhm.
all the subsequent leaf certificates, where are the leaf certificates being stored? What are the policies around that? Uh, and again, to touch on the C agnostic idea, what happens if your key pairs are actually being generated from other vaults? In other words, if you're utilizing best practices in DevOps and RPA and other use cases, you might be using uh, basically vaults from public clouds or other systems that you need to integrate to. So
Yeah.
isn't it interesting, Tim? Part of this is this kind of highlights agnosticism in many ways. In order to do true key management in a modern world, in a modern context, not only do you need that CLM to automate all the different issuance and provisioning, but you also need to be able to integrate and therefore be agnostic to where did the cert come from?
Right.
Where are the key pairs being stored? How do you enforce those policies? These should now be considered core capabilities of key management.
Right. And the benefits of key management are a few, right, Jay? It's part of it is that if you've got your keys successfully locked away in some kind of, you know, HSM or TPM or something like that, then they're just much more secure, right? Theft of those keys has become exponentially harder. Another benefit though is that if you've got proper key management, you don't lose the key, because if you lose the key, you can't decrypt, right?
We're seeing this problem right now, Tim. Interestingly, and we've podcasted on the subject in cryptocurrencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cryptocurrencies right now, because it's a nascent, very new subject, they're still building up their capabilities around key management, and they've had major problems.
Yeah.
Um, Tim, we've even seen in our world key management failures in the European region for their COVID certificates, where
Yeah.
the root key of COVID certificates in Europe was compromised, and leaf certificates for people's identities have been forged. What an
Right.
incredibly what a huge example of the
You,
importance of key management.
you can buy a fake COVID certificate in Europe if you know where to go for $300 because somebody stole the key.
You know, I was a much younger person when I first saw an HSM, so incredibly important for your root key material. But keep in mind, Tim, you know, with Windows 11, the importance of TPM, the importance of secure elements for mobile devices and IoT, this is a huge subject.
Yeah, and then to your earlier point, key management isn't an island. Key management has to integrate into your entire CLM strategy and your entire certificate lifecycle and your entire usage lifecycle, or it doesn't really work.
That's it.
Yeah. All right. So we were going to return to a topic, which is you talked about sort of this variety and set of requirements around the certificate. We need to be able to tolerate all of those. So I just wanted to take a hack at what that was, right? So when we say that something is, I'm going to use a word here, Jay, a little bit of a coinage, certificate agnostic, right? What do we mean when we're saying certificate agnostic? We're meaning that all of your certificates, no matter where they come from, no matter how they're configured, they all work. So what's that list? Type of certificate, right? I don't care if it's SSL, code signing, SMIME, doc signing, SSH cert, etc. I want it to work. Also within SSL, EVO, VDV. They just got to all work. Configuration, term, as we've seen, they go from 2 hours to multiple years. Hashing algorithm, key size, cipher suite, etc. Right? What fields are you using? Are you using the OU field? Are you not using the O field, etc.? All of that needs to be built into configuration. Environment. What's the operating system? Right? What's in your environment? And also, if you get into things like IoT devices, you might have constrained memory or constrained bandwidth, right? That's part of your environment that needs to be considered as well. And use cases, what are you doing with it? How are you using it, right? There's a difference between an SMIME cert that is being used as a device certificate sitting on a bespoke device and an SMIME cert that's got to be pushed down as an email cert to a user's BYOD phone, right? That's a different use case. It needs to be dealt with in a different way. And then physical location, which I was just kind of getting at, right? Servers, laptops, BYOD devices, IoT devices, Wi-Fi nodes, routers, stuff that's in my cloud, stuff that's in my bespoke server closet, etc. Right, and all of that's got to work for all of that because we have all those environments that are all running. And then the last point you hit, Jay, what's the origin? Is this private or public? Is this from my own private CA that I'm running on premises? Is this from my MSCA? Is this from a managed private CA that I'm getting through a third party? Shouldn't matter, can't matter. All of the things on this list, they're all real use cases. Your certificates are really happening in the real world based on all of these things. And any one of those certificates failing, despite the answer to any of these 5 green questions, is still a failure that causes you business problems and can potentially cause vast business problems.
That's right, Tim. So, I don't think the point can be made clearly enough. The reason why we're, trying to coin certificate agnostic is because it really highlights the point that CA agnostic, as an important insider's term, is really only one of these.
Right.
Right. And this is, as when we were talking about this internally, that's the point we were really trying to make, and why we talk about certificate agnostic as part of a presentation on CA agnostic.
Yeah, exactly. And CA agnostic is important, obviously. That's kind of covered in this thing at the bottom where we said origin, right? CA agnostic is definitely important, but just focusing zero in on CA agnostic, which you're right, Jay, is an industry term. Like industry people say that. But if we just focus in on CA agnostic, we miss these other points, which are incredibly important, right? Got to work with all your certificate types. Got to work in all your environments. Got to work with any way you might configure your certs, etc. And without that, you're still not really truly solving the problem.
That's right, Tim. This really is taking one step back, and as an industry insider, when you're the 20-year plus grizzled, PKI veteran, it's sometimes way too easy to get hung up on some specific internal terminology. To us, this came out of self-reflection and trying to understand what would be a better way of thinking about C agnostic in its proper context, the way that a CIO, a CISO, a risk officer might think about it.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And these are all, and furthermore, just sorry to beat the dead horse here, but I'll just hit it one more time. The I'm not even sure that all of those CIOs and CISOs have thought this through. So part of what we're trying to do also with these ideas is help somebody think, oh, gee, this is the set of things that I've got to be able to deal with.
The proof that that many of them haven't thought it through, Tim, is because even some of the most basic things, such as discovery that we talked about earlier, is not being done even by companies that have more than enough resources to handle it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And again, look at those examples we showed. So, but also, Jason, I think you pointed out again on our podcast not that long ago that there are some more subtle things that should be considered when you're looking at a certificate agnostic CLM that once again might not be visible at first blush to that CISO, but are actually going to be really important when you start using this in the real world. So do you want to walk us through those?
Sure, Tim. Even not quite in order, but let's just go through. Basically, if you're thinking about procurement, right? This is where I'm coming at this angle. Is consider yourself somebody who's in the business of procuring certificate lifecycle management. The challenge I'd like to give to a vendor when you're looking at that procurement cycle is, hey, do I have to go off and get multiple contracts signed? In other words, do I get a CLM as well as my certs, right? In other words, can you do public issuance? Can you do private issuance?
Right.
Can you
do
my
support
CLM all in one?
MSCA? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're obviously the main point of this whole presentation is, if you're a procurement officer for CLM technologies, you really should be demanding CA agnostic as part of what we've shown. But part of it also is, hey, are you forcing me to go to multiple vendors? And also the multiple vendors, in point number one here is, look at that new breadth of capabilities that you need in a modern enterprise. In other words, you've heard the term machine identities, Tim, and that's great. There's a lot of transformational use cases within machine identities. But what happens when you also need to have visibility to your SMIME certificates and also have visibility to your certificate lifecycle management for document signing digital identities? In other words, human use cases. So if your CLM vendor is only doing machine identity, you might be missing out.
Right. Then you're missing out on some of the things that we had on this list right here, right? If you, and I think that's an important point, Jay, is, machine identities are definitely a very important part of digital identities, but human identities are as well, right? And we're doing both of them. We're doing both of them with certificates. And so when you're talking about all the different of types and use cases that you're using, you do need to be able to cover both of those scenarios, or you're not getting them all. Yeah. Yeah, and then this last point is, I think, important too, and you made this point as well to me, which is, are you getting on board with a PKI expert who can help you ensure that your increasingly diverse and complicated and high stakes digital identity environments continue to be secure, cryptographically sound, compliant, and can they help continue to do that moving into the future as needs and use cases and regulations change?
So, Tim, one of the use case I'm thinking about there is, it won't be that long from now. And, of course, every quarter, every year seems to be a lifetime.
Mm,
But when you consider, 2025, 2026, in fact, it's not going to be that long, probably 2023, when NIST hands down its list of new cryptographic algorithms for
yeah,
quantum resistant computing. And that's going to affect public trust, private trust. It's going to affect, even things like signing
all of it,
documents, all of it. It's going
everything.
to affect every single thing we just said. Is your vendor already allowing you to get your hands dirty with concepts such as hybrid certificates and being able to touch these new cryptographic algorithms
Yeah,
outside of the ones we use right now, such as RSA, ECC? Well, believe me, there's a whole host of other ones that are coming. It's not going to just be one or two, and you need to be able to get your hands dirty with it now. Is your vendor
yeah.
allowing you to do that?
And is your vendor going to be there with solutions for you on day one? Right? Is your vendor
Yeah.
going to be current exactly when the primitives come down from NIST and we're able to take them and consider them to be gospel and move forward? At that point, are you going to get them right away? And are you going to have had the background and the knowledge you need to understand what you're doing with them? And are you going to have personnel, who are providing you support, who know what the heck they're talking about? And all of that is absolutely important. And that's just one. I mean, that's just one, Jay, right? These things happen in the world of cryptography. Now, obviously, quantum computing is huge because that's going to force us to throw out RSA and ECC. It's going to be radically important, but it's not the only one we've dealt with by a long shot. We had to deprecate SHA-1, we had to deal with Heartbleed, we had to deal with Debian. Like, this stuff comes up, and as it comes up, do you have a partner who understands what they're looking at?
That's it, Tim. I think anybody who's looking at these technologies, if you are thinking about agnostic as being important, you're thinking the right way. But we really want to angle you to understanding. A lot of the vendors, everybody's got their angle, everybody has their set of strengths, but you need to challenge your vendors. They have to hit all these marks, or your future is going to be, your investment's not going to have the value that it should have into the future.
All right. So that was what we had to say today. If you liked this conversation, Jason and I think that came up already in this presentation, but Jason and I run a popular podcast. It's called Root Causes, a PKI and Security podcast. We're nearing our 200th episode. How mind-blowing is that, Jay? And you can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search on Root Causes PKI, and you'll find us on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, etc. Please come join us. We talk about all kinds of aspects of the world of PKI. And with that, I think we're ready for questions. Kristen, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Tim, we got a few questions.
Okay.
First off, what about different form factors such as SMIME and SSH?
I think a really good certificate lifecycle management system that is CA agnostic really needs to be able to tick the box of, hey, are you also form factor agnostic, right?
Yeah.
There's so many different ways we could throw out that term agnostic. In other words, if your CLM is forcing you to only use a subset and does not have a roadmap to basically looking at any form of digital identity, then you're going to be pigeonholed into, all right, well, I don't have a single pane of glass. I need to go get a second CLM to now handle these other use cases. And the last thing I think anybody wants is another set of tools and another interface to have to obsess over. That's how I think about those form factors, Kristen.
Thank you, Jason. And from a current customer, can we use SEM to work with our local Microsoft CA server? If so, is there documentation anywhere?
SCM stands for Sectigo Certificate Manager, just for the group. Go ahead, Jay.
No, Tim, the answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, there's really two ways we think about Microsoft CA, and I'm glad for the question because Tim, we in fact we had a recent podcast about some major white hat research on the weaknesses of Microsoft CA as an on-prem legacy CA, and like I say, there's two ways we think about it. One is replacement, which is not always possible, but it is a consideration because of the fact that a lot of these modern use cases, such as mobile devices, DevOps, etc., Microsoft CA is just not delivering that to you. If you are in a position where you cannot rip that out, you need to be able to add an abstraction layer to that. And in other words, what we like to call augmentation of Microsoft CA. And yes, we definitely have those capabilities, and we have a lot of documentation in terms of how we can help you to get there.
Absolutely, and I'll ensure we connect with them offline to provide that documentation. So next question, what other new and evolving use cases are on the way?
I would say some of the interesting ones that are hitting right now, and Tim, you jump in, but a
Mhm.
lot of credential vault use cases right now. So in other words, I think what's interesting is we often talk about CIOs and CISOs and risk officers. I think the people we need to be listening to and talking about a lot more are developers and operations people. In other words, bottom up driven demand. Uh, HashiCorp is a good example of use cases where I bet you a CIO 5 years ago would never have dreamed of anything HashiCorp's doing today.
Mhm.
However, developers knew it. And so the usage of credential vaults to be form factor agnostic and using best practices of not hard coding certificates. In other words, good key management in some ways, whether it's a symmetric key, asymmetric key. These are important topics right now that I think over the next little while will continue to grow.
And I agree with that. What I was thinking of, what I was going to jump in with, which I think is worth mentioning here, is we mentioned it early on, but we didn't talk about it, is robotic process automation. So if you think about RPA, right, the idea here is I'm going to have an agent that's going to mimic what would have been repeatable human processes, and I'm going to do this complexly or with complexity through a good amount of my business process lifecycle, which means I'm moving between tasks and systems and making different decisions based on what I run into and what I discover. And so you wind up with a robotic process that has a great deal of capability. You're moving laterally inside the organization. You're requesting and receiving information. You're taking action, right? And causing that to actually occur. Well, gee, how do you differentiate between the actions of an RPA system and the actions of an advanced persistent threat who's inside your environment, right? Who move laterally and request information and give commands and take action. And there's only one answer, and that's digital identity. There's no other answer. And
That's it,
so
Tim.
that's I think that's a perfect case study in
Yeah,
how evolving business practices lead to these evolving needs.
that's it, Tim. That's why credential. That's why I brought up credential vaults because it actually spans various kinds of enterprise use cases, including DevOps and RPA, and it will actually include other use cases we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, to some degree, what's interesting about that question is you could almost interpret that question as, well, what's the new stuff we're going to think about tomorrow? And the answer would be, well, we don't know, we haven't thought about it. But if history is any guide, someone will think about it. And if we're giving this webinar in another year, there will be new topics that aren't here right now that we'll be discussing, right? And so, how are you future-proofing yourself for that?
I'm going to add just one little bit to this as well.
Mhm.
I would say that remote identity, basically identity vetting, that includes things such as on blockchain attributes. That's
Mm,
one that is probably not hot right now, but probably will be down the road. So that I would add that as a number 2.
cool. I love it.
Thanks, guys. Next, how does cert management dovetail with managing other authorization or authentication tokens like JWT?
I would say here's what's important to note. In let's say you've got a domain controller, right? Microsoft domain controller that we all know and love, Active Directory managed. Key management of basically authentication into that domain controller. I think that what the bad guys have taught us is that unless you protect down to that level, things such as any form of API key meant for single sign-on or whatever you're using those tokens for, that actually is incredibly important to protect. And therefore, quite often, there's a PKI behind the scenes whenever you're dealing with a symmetric token issuance for single sign-on or to basically operationalize the system. So let me put that into English. There's been a lot of talk. If you watch the recent Twitter feeds about this topic, really any form of API token is just another way of saying a password, but it's a password being used by a machine. Symmetric key management. Tim, this is a subject we didn't bring up during this webinar, and that's why I'm glad the question maybe came up, because symmetric token management of any kind, typically those symmetric tokens are going to be signed by an asymmetric digital identity, therefore PKI. Typically there's PKI behind the scenes, which means there's going to need to be a CLM behind the scenes of any form of symmetric tokenized system.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. Next question. Do shortening certificate lifespans fit into this discussion?
Yeah. Yeah,
It
sure.
might be the center of the discussion, Tim.
Yeah. It just increases the stakes on all of this, right? Like just a few years ago, you could have had a 3-year public SSL cert, and now you're down to 1 year. And I am publicly predicting that that's not over, right? That we're going to see 9 months, 6 months, and even conceivably 90 days in our in the not terribly distant future, right? Not in the next year or two, but that all of that is facing us. And it's not just SSL, right? Apple recently has declared that as a requirement for its root program, public CAs are going to be limited to issue SMIME certs for not more than 2 years, 27 months, right? 825 days to be precise. And so what that'll do is that'll further shorten that lifespan. And the reasons for that, and part of the reason I'm confident in this, is the reasons for that are not changing, right? The reasons for that are shorter certificates are more secure, right? If you lose your private key and don't know that you lost it, the total potential attack time before it's irrelevant is less if the cert's shorter, right? And things along those lines. So first of all, shorter term certificates are just more secure. And second of all, it gives us a greater overall crypto agility, right? Because if the old certificates term out more quickly, then the new certificates that are issued are going to be compliant with new standards, and all that stuff is going to switch out faster. So for both of those reasons, those are very compelling reasons, and they're compelling not just to security eggheads, but they're compelling to the real decision makers who force change, who are people like root store programs. And so for that reason, yeah, I think that's going to keep going. And as certificates get shorter and shorter, what happens? Volume increases, frequency of some kind of revocation or other crisis event increases, and complexity increases. And all of that stuff means you got to have the automated organizational capability to handle that.
Thanks, Tim. Next, are there reasons I might want my public CA to be different from my certificate management platform provider?
I can tell you that yeah, go ahead, Tim. I do have an idea of dual sourcing. I can tell you one
right. That's just what I was going to say. So keep going.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. No, because we deal a lot with consortia who use us as their back-end CA for issuance for interoperability purposes. And if you consider just how important the uptime of some of these consortia is, it actually makes a lot of sense to dual source a CA. In other words, if there's any problem at all with one, you have a backbone to be able to go to the other, and it just makes good sense. That kind of duplicate CA platform in the back end is quite common whenever things are mission critical.
Yeah, and the basic idea would be to say that I know they both work successfully. I have a business relationship with both of them. I understand from an automation perspective they're both using. And the one that was a real wake-up call for people for this was Diginotar, right? Where this CA had been around a long time. It was pretty well established in the country it operated in, and then it failed very spectacularly and suddenly, and all of a sudden people just plain didn't have a reliable cert anymore, right? Just their certs were on untrusted routes the next day, and they had to run out and scramble and find a new vendor and get contracts signed and get it integrated and make sure it was working, and it was a real pain point for the people who depended on that CA. And so coming out of that, there is a school of thought that says you have at least two providers that can always do the job. And that way, in the unlikely event that one of those providers vanished in the night, the other one could just up their volume and take it over. Not everybody feels that's necessary, but it's a real thing that we really see. I'd say that's really the one. And that's not about your CLM provider and your public cert provider being different. It's about you must have more than one public cert provider to follow that scenario, and therefore by design one of them is not going to be the same as your CLM provider, right? And that goes back to where we're saying you need to be able to handle public certs from multiple providers, right? That's one of the things that we think certificate agnostic involves, and it's mostly for that reason.
Great. Last question. Can I do my certificate management through Acme?
Yes. Next question.
Yes, but remember, Acme is just an API. So if you're sitting inside of a CLM, you've got the things we talked about. You are seeing when your certificates expire. You are looking at dashboards. You are automatically dealing with them. There has to be software that does that. Acme is a bridge, and something's got to drive that bridge. And if you want to sit and write that yourself, go for it. But
yeah, Acme is we talked earlier about provisioning technologies, Tim. Yeah. Acme, if you want to fit it into the conversation, it is a provisioning technology, period.
Right.
And it is not a CLM, and it is not issuance. Right, it is a provisioning technology, and I like it. I really like Acme.
Yeah, it's a great provisioning technology, and if
terrific.
If your CLM doesn't support Acme, that is a big gap.
I would say if your CLM doesn't support Acme, you got to really question that.
Yeah,
I would say, Tim, that Acme is even being used now in DevOps in private sense. It's even being used in some other ways. So as a provisioning technology, it's great. But keep in mind, right, the world's largest Acme implementation right now in public trust has absolutely no CLM.
Right.
In other words, don't confuse Acme with certificate lifecycle management. Do
Right.
not confuse it for visibility. It has, and do not confuse it for discovery. In other words, all these things we consider to be hallmarks and capabilities, core capabilities of CLM. Acme is merely one piece and is absolutely not the others.
And okay, and Kristen, I want to ask a question if I may. I actually know the answer to this, Jay, but I was thinking about this when you were talking earlier. Is directly relevant to this whole conversation. I think, and you touched, you brushed on this on your way to something else. Is let's talk a little bit about certificate pinning and the why that's a bad practice, and why we shouldn't want to do that.
Sure, certificate pinning.
Yeah.
You know what? There was a problem
Mhm.
way back in the day. We're talking in the earlier days of mobile applications doing important things, such as banking, as an example. And unfortunately, there was a problem at the time with mobile operating systems being way too forgiving and easy to allow people to be easily socially engineered to implement certificates that were self signed by bad guys. In other words, you could get a text message saying, "Hey, click here for God knows what reason that I think you'll agree to," and just say yes. And when it says to implement and install a self-signed certificate, and so therefore you would then use your mobile banking application, and you might not be actually talking to the, the actual bank that you thought you were talking to. Enter the idea of certificate pinning. In other words, when you went to your real legitimate banking application, a certificate pinning concept would hard code public keys that basically would say, unless you see these public keys, do not log in. Well, that was a great idea in a way, because even if you had been socially engineered to implement a rogue certificate, you would be protected. The problem is this: that was back in the day when certificates for APIs didn't change very much at all. But now we roll the keys
Yeah.
all the time. And so therefore, you cannot do an update to your banking application often enough. And so therefore, the idea of certificate pinning was causing breakages. So you could not log in to the banking application when the API keys changed. Therefore, certificate pinning was a good idea to a problem at the time, but now
But
because of
no.
it's no longer really best practice.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. You said something that reminded me of that, so I wanted to get that out there.
Right. And with that, it's a wrap. As
All
always,
right.
thank you, Jason. Thank you, Tim.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Tristan.
And thank you all for joining.